The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Chief James Wilson adjusted his casual weekend attire, a simple navy blue sweater and khaki pants, in front of his bedroom mirror. At 52 years old, his salt and pepper hair and distinguished features reflected 2.5 decades of dedicated police service. Today was supposed to be his day off, a rare Saturday morning when he could shed the weight of his badge and uniform to simply be James, a regular citizen running errands. The modest two-story house he called home sat quietly in a middle-class neighborhood of Maplewood, a medium-sized city where he had made history 3 years ago by becoming their first black chief of police. The achievement hadn't come easily. Wilson had worked his way up from patrol officer, earning every promotion through merit, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As he grabbed his car keys from the ceramic bowl by the front door, his wife Sarah called out from the kitchen, "Don't forget to pick up everything on the list this time." Her playful reminder made him smile. Last weekend, he'd forgotten half the items they needed for their daughter's upcoming visit from college. "Got it right here," he responded, patting his pocket where the carefully folded shopping list resided. The morning sun felt warm on his face as he walked to his personal vehicle, a modest Honda Civic. He deliberately chose to drive this instead of his official police vehicle on his days off, part of his philosophy about being connected to the community he served. The drive to Mason's supermarket was uneventful, with Wilson humming along to old Motown classics on the radio. He had chosen this particular store, located in the bustling commercial district, because it usually had everything on Sarah's precise shopping list. As he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed it was busier than usual for a Saturday morning. What caught his attention, however, was a figure standing near the entrance. A man, probably in his mid-30s, was wearing what appeared to be a police uniform, but something seemed off about it. Wilson's trained eye quickly spotted the inconsistencies. The badge looked cheaper than standard issue. The uniform shirt was a slightly different shade of blue than what local departments used, and the utility belt appeared to be a costume-grade replica. As a law enforcement veteran, Wilson had encountered police impersonators before. They were usually harmless one-abes living out their fantasies, but occasionally they posed real threats to public safety. He decided to keep an eye on the situation while going about his shopping, not wanting to create a scene if unnecessary. Inside the store, Wilson grabbed a shopping cart and began methodically working through Sarah's list. As he selected fresh vegetables from the produce section, he overheard worried whispers from other shoppers. An elderly Hispanic woman was telling her daughter about being questioned by a rude officer in the parking lot who had demanded to see her driver's license. In the next aisle, Wilson noticed a young Middle Eastern man looking visibly shaken as he spoke quietly on his phone, describing how he had been harassed by someone claiming to be neighborhood security. The pattern was becoming clear. The fake officer outside was targeting people of color. Wilson's day off suddenly became more complicated. As chief of police, he had worked tirelessly to build trust between law enforcement and minority communities. The department had made significant progress under his leadership, implementing diversity training, community outreach programs, and strict accountability measures. One misguided individual acting as a fake cop could undo months of careful relationship building. Still, Wilson maintained his composure, continuing with his shopping while keeping his police radio earpiece in place, a habit he never broke even on off-duty days. He hadn't called for backup yet, preferring to assess the situation fully first. 25 years on the force had taught him the value of patience and observation. As he filled his cart with the last few items on the list, Wilson could hear more concerned murmurs throughout the store. The fake officer had apparently moved inside and was now patrolling the aisles, asking certain shoppers to show their receipts or identification. The chief knew it was only a matter of time before their paths would cross. Wilson headed toward the checkout lines, his mind already formulating various approaches to handle the situation. He hadn't planned on working today, but as his mentor had told him years ago, a good cop is never truly off duty when it comes to protecting the community. Little did he know that the next few minutes would test not only his professional training, but also his personal resolve in ways he couldn't imagine. The fluorescent lights of Mason's supermarket buzzed overhead as Wilson paid for his groceries. The cashier, a young woman named Jenny who had worked there for years, seemed nervous as she scanned his items. Her hands trembled slightly, and she kept glancing toward the store entrance. "Everything okay, Jenny?" Wilson asked quietly, noting her unusual behavior. "That security person out there," she whispered, bagging his groceries. He's been causing trouble all morning. Made Mrs. Rodriguez cry when she couldn't show him proper ID, and she's been shopping here for 20 years. Jenny's voice carried a mixture of anger and fear. Wilson nodded sympathetically, his concern growing. He had known Mrs. Rodriguez since becoming chief. She often brought homemade tamales to community police meetings. The thought of her being harassed made his jaw tighten, but he maintained his calm demeanor. As he pushed his cart toward the exit, Wilson observed the fake officer more closely. The man stood about 6 feet tall with a stocky build, his fake uniform stretched tight across his chest. A cheap plastic badge gleamed under the morning sun, and a pair of mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes. He was currently questioning a young black college student who appeared to be on his way to work, judging by his barista uniform. The impersonator's voice carried across the parking lot, loud and unnecessarily aggressive. "Show me your receipt right now. How do I know you didn't steal that backpack?" The student was trying to explain that he was just walking through the parking lot to get to the coffee shop next door, but the fake cop wasn't listening. Wilson began loading his groceries into his car, positioning himself to keep an eye on the situation. He noticed other shoppers hurrying to their vehicles, heads down, trying to avoid attracting attention. This wasn't the community atmosphere he had worked so hard to build in Maplewood. The fake officer finally let the student go, but not before making several racially charged comments that made Wilson's blood boil. Still, he remained professional, continuing to observe while considering the best approach. His years of experience told him that confronting someone like this required the right timing and strategy. Just then, Wilson's police radio crackled to life in his earpiece. A patrol unit was reporting multiple calls about a suspicious person harassing shoppers at Mason's supermarket. They were requesting guidance on how to proceed. Wilson decided to wait for backup before taking action. It would be safer for everyone involved. As he placed the last bag in his trunk, Wilson heard heavy footsteps approaching from behind. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Years of police work had given him a sixth sense for trouble. He turned slowly to face the fake officer, who had apparently decided to make Wilson his next target. "Hey you," the impersonator barked, his hand resting on what appeared to be a plastic baton. "What's in all those bags? Let me see your receipt." Wilson noticed several customers had stopped to watch, some already pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The fake officer's demeanor became more aggressive as he stepped closer, clearly trying to intimidate whom he thought was just another black shopper. "Sir," Wilson began calmly, "I don't believe you have the authority to." "Shut up," the impersonator interrupted, his face reddening. "I'm neighborhood security, and I've been watching you acting suspicious. People like you need to learn to respect authority." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Wilson. He could hear police sirens in the distance. His backup was on the way, but before he could speak again, the fake officer made a critical mistake that would change everything. "Empty your pockets," he demanded, moving into Wilson's personal space. When Wilson didn't immediately comply, the impersonator's face twisted with rage. "I said empty them now." Several gasps echoed across the parking lot as the fake officer raised his hand. Wilson saw it coming but chose not to react. Sometimes the best way to expose someone's true nature was to let them show it themselves. The impersonator's hand swung through the air, making contact with Wilson's face in a loud slap that echoed through the suddenly silent parking lot. Time seemed to freeze as phones recorded. Witnesses stood shocked, and the fake officer stood there, his hand still raised, unaware that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The slap hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Wilson's cheeks stung, but his expression remained calm and controlled. The parking lot had gone completely silent, save for the approaching police sirens growing louder by the second. The fake officer's face showed a mixture of anger and satisfaction, clearly believing he had just established his authority. "Now," the impersonator growled, "are you going to show some respect?" Wilson slowly reached into his back pocket, his movements deliberate and measured. The fake officer tensed, probably expecting to see a receipt or ID. Instead, Wilson pulled out his police badge, its gold surface catching the morning sunlight. He held it up at eye level, letting the impersonator read the words "Chief of Police" engraved beneath the city seal. "Actually," Wilson said quietly, "I think we need to discuss your definition of respect." The color drained from the fake officer's face so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The plastic baton slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering to the asphalt. Two police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. Officers Martinez and Johnson, both veterans whom Wilson had personally trained, jumped out with their hands on their weapons. They quickly assessed the situation, their expressions changing from concern to shock as they recognized their chief. "Everything's under control," Wilson called out to his officers, never taking his eyes off the impersonator. "But please do escort this gentleman into custody." His voice carried the weight of authority that came naturally after years of service. The fake officer suddenly found his voice. "Wait, I can explain. I didn't know. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." His previous bravado had evaporated, replaced by desperate pleading. "Protect it from what?" Wilson asked, his tone stern but level. "From Mrs. Rodriguez buying her groceries? From a college student walking to work? From me loading my car?" He gestured to the gathering crowd of witnesses, many still recording with their phones. "Look around. The only person causing trouble here is you." Officer Martinez moved forward with handcuffs while Johnson began documenting the scene. The impersonator's shoulders slumped in defeat as the steel bracelets clicked around his wrists. Several onlookers applauded, but Wilson raised his hand for quiet. "I want everyone who was harassed by this individual to stay and give statements to my officers," he announced to the crowd. "What happened here today isn't just about assaulting a police chief. It's about the systematic harassment of our community members, and we're going to address it properly." More patrol cars arrived, and Wilson noticed news vans pulling into the parking lot. The story was already spreading. He touched his cheek where the slap had landed, knowing it would bruise but also understanding that this incident could serve a greater purpose. Mrs. Rodriguez emerged from the store, her eyes wide with concern. "Chief Wilson, are you okay?" she asked in her heavily accented English. "I saw what he did to you." Wilson smiled gently at her. "I'm fine, Mrs. Rodriguez. But I'd like to hear about your experience with this man. Officer Chen here will take your statement." He gestured to a female officer who had just arrived. As the fake officer was placed in the back of a patrol car, Wilson could hear him muttering about how he was just trying to help and didn't mean any harm. But the chief knew better. The man's actions had revealed his true intentions, using a fake position of authority to intimidate and harass people based on their race. Wilson's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Sarah, probably wondering what was taking so long with the groceries. He smiled, imagining how this story would sound when he told her over dinner. But right now, he had work to do. The morning sun continued to rise over the parking lot as Wilson coordinated with his officers, ensuring that every victim's statement was taken, every piece of evidence was collected, and every witness was interviewed. What had started as a simple grocery run had turned into something much more significant. A stark reminder that the fight against prejudice and abuse of power never truly takes a day off. As he watched his officers work, Wilson knew that this incident would become a teaching moment for his department and the community. Sometimes, he reflected, the most powerful lessons about justice and dignity come when you least expect them. Back at the Maplewood police station, the atmosphere was tense as officers processed the fake cop, now identified as Michael Brennan, a 35-year-old local resident with a history of filing false police reports about suspicious individuals in his neighborhood. The booking photos showed a very different man from the one who had strutted around the supermarket parking lot. His fake uniform had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit, and his arrogant demeanor had dissolved into a mixture of shame and fear. Wilson sat in his office, holding an ice pack to his cheek while reviewing the witness statements. The evidence was overwhelming. Over a dozen people had come forward with stories of harassment, each one painting a clear picture of targeted racial profiling. The chief's administrative assistant, Linda, knocked on his door with yet another update. "Sir, the mayor's on line 1, CNN is on line 2, and your wife is in the lobby," Linda said, looking concerned. "Also, that video of the incident has gone viral. It's already got over 1 million views." Wilson sighed, putting down the ice pack. "Send Sarah in first. The others can wait." Family always came first. That was one of his unwavering principles. Sarah Wilson burst into the office, her face a mixture of worry and anger. She rushed to examine his bruised cheek, her nurse's training evident in how she gently assessed the injury. "James Wilson, only you would go grocery shopping and end up arresting a racist fake cop," she said, shaking her head. The groceries are still in the car, he admitted with a small smile. Forget the groceries. Have you seen what people are saying online? You're trending on Twitter. Our daughter's been calling nonstop from college. Sarah pulled out her phone to show him the flood of social media posts. Wilson scrolled through the comments. Many praised his calm handling of the situation, while others used the incident to highlight broader issues of racial profiling and vigilantism. His phone buzzed again. The police chiefs from neighboring cities were reaching out, offering support and requesting guidance on handling similar situations. Detective Rodriguez knocked and entered, carrying a preliminary report. "Chief, we've finished interviewing Brennan. You're not going to believe this. He's part of an online group that encourages people to conduct citizen patrols in what they call suspicious neighborhoods." Rodriguez's disgust was evident in his voice. "Any actual security credentials?" Wilson asked, though he already knew the answer. "None. He bought the uniform online and printed fake ID cards at home. But here's the kicker. He's been doing this for weeks at different locations around the city. We're getting calls from other victims now." Wilson stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the city he'd sworn to protect. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, where news vans had already begun to gather. You could see Officer Chen trying to organize an impromptu press area. "How's he handling the charges?" Wilson asked, still watching the scene below. Rodriguez couldn't help but smile. He's requested a lawyer and keeps insisting he was just trying to help the community. But when we showed him your actual credentials and service record, he threw up in the holding cell. Sarah touched her husband's arm. "What are you going to do?" Wilson turned back to face them, his expression resolute. "We're going to handle this by the book. No special treatment, no revenge charges. He'll face the consequences of his actions through proper legal channels." He paused, then added, "But we're also going to use this incident to make some changes." He picked up his phone and began dialing. "Linda," he called out to his assistant, "schedule a community meeting for tomorrow evening. Contact all the neighborhood associations, religious leaders, and civil rights organizations. It's time we had a real conversation about profiling and vigilantism in our city." As Wilson finally returned the mayor's call, he could hear the commotion growing outside his office. More victims were arriving to file reports, reporters were demanding statements, and through it all, his officers maintained professional composure, just as he trained them. The day was far from over, and his cheeks still throbbed from the slap, but Chief James Wilson knew that sometimes the most important lessons about justice came with a sting. As he prepared to face the media circus waiting outside, he straightened his tie and remembered what his father had always told him. "Son, dignity isn't just about how you carry yourself, it's about how you carry others through their worst moments." The community meeting hall was packed to capacity the next evening. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The air was thick with tension and expectation as Chief Wilson took his place at the podium, the bruise on his cheek now a visible reminder of yesterday's incident. Local news cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking in the dimly lit room. Wilson spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the front row. The young barista who had been harassed was there with his co-workers, and even Jenny from the supermarket had come with several other store employees. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Wilson began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. What happened yesterday wasn't just about one man slapping a police chief. It was about something much deeper that we need to address as a community. The room fell silent as Wilson stepped away from the podium, choosing instead to walk to the front of the stage and sit on its edge, a deliberate move to break down barriers between himself and the community. "In my 25 years of service, I've worn this badge with pride," he continued, touching the shield on his chest. "But yesterday, I experienced what many of you have faced, being judged, harassed, and assaulted simply because of the color of my skin." From the back of the room, a voice called out, "But you're the chief. You had the power to stop him." Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I did. But how many others don't? How many of our neighbors suffer in silence because they don't have a badge to pull out? That's what we're here to discuss tonight." He gestured to a screen behind him where photos from security cameras showed Brennan harassing various community members over the past few weeks. These incidents went unreported because people were afraid. They didn't trust that they would be believed or that anything would be done. The room grew heavy with recognition as people saw themselves or their neighbors in those images. Some wiped away tears, while others nodded in grim understanding. "Today, I met with Mr. Brennan's family," Wilson revealed, causing a stir in the audience. They were horrified by his actions. His sister told me he'd become increasingly isolated over the past year, spending more time on extremist websites that fed his fears and prejudices. Wilson stood up, walking slowly across the stage. But this isn't just about Michael Brennan. It's about the systems and attitudes that made him think his actions were acceptable. It's about the silence that allowed him to continue for weeks before he made the mistake of targeting the wrong person. The police chief then outlined his new initiative, a comprehensive community response program that would include improved reporting systems for harassment, additional training for officers in handling bias-related incidents, and the establishment of neighborhood liaison teams to build trust between law enforcement and residents. Starting tomorrow, Wilson announced, we're launching a new anonymous reporting hotline. Every complaint will be investigated, every victim will be heard, and every incident will be taken seriously. As he spoke, officers began distributing information packets to the audience. Wilson noticed some of his most experienced officers nodding in agreement. They had seen firsthand how fear and mistrust could fracture a community. "Mr. Brennan will face justice for his actions," Wilson continued, "but our response can't stop there. We need to address the root causes that lead people to think they can take the law into their own hands." The meeting continued for hours, with community members sharing their stories and offering suggestions. Wilson listened to each speaker, taking notes and asking questions. The bruise on his cheek had become more than just a mark of violence. It was now a symbol of the changes needed in their city. As the meeting drew to a close, Mrs. Rodriguez approached the chief with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, holding his hand. "For the first time, I feel like someone in power truly understands." Wilson squeezed her hand gently, remembering how his own grandmother had faced similar prejudices decades ago. Some battles, he realized, took generations to win. But as he looked around the room at the diverse faces of his community coming together, he saw something that gave him hope. The beginning of real change. Outside, the evening news crews were already broadcasting their reports, but the real story was happening inside, where people who had been strangers just hours ago were now exchanging phone numbers and making plans to work together for a better community. 1 week after the supermarket incident, the changes in Maplewood were already visible. The police station's lobby had been transformed into a welcoming community space, with new signs in multiple languages and a dedicated desk for reporting harassment incidents. Officers moved through the building with renewed purpose, many having just completed their first session of enhanced community relations training. Chief Wilson sat in the district attorney's office, reviewing the charges against Michael Brennan. The evidence pile had grown substantially as more victims came forward, encouraged by the chief's own experience. The DA, Sandra Martinez, spread the files across her desk. "We've got him on multiple counts," Martinez explained, flipping through the documents. "Assault on a police officer, impersonating law enforcement, hate crimes, harassment. The list goes on. But there's something interesting you should see." She handed Wilson a stack of printed emails. They were messages between Brennan and various online groups, revealing a network of self-appointed neighborhood watchdogs operating across several states. The chief's incident had unexpectedly exposed a larger problem. "This is bigger than Maplewood," Wilson said, studying the papers. "These groups are encouraging people to take the law into their own hands." The DA nodded grimly. "The FBI's involved now. Your case broke open investigations in 3 other cities. Turns out Brennan was just a small part of a larger network." Wilson's phone buzzed, a text from Sarah reminding him about their daughter's arrival. Lisa was flying in from college to give a speech at her old high school about the incident involving her father. The story had resonated with young people across the country. Back at the station, Officer Chen was leading a community outreach session in the newly established meeting room. Local residents, including many who had been victimized by Brennan, were learning about their rights and how to report incidents properly. The atmosphere was different now. People felt heard and supported. "Chief," Chen called out as Wilson passed by, "would you mind sharing your perspective with the group?" Wilson entered the room, noticing how the participants straightened up but didn't tense up, a subtle but important difference. He pulled up a chair, joining the circle rather than standing apart. "You know, before last week, I thought I understood what many of you face," he began. "But experiencing it firsthand changed something in me. It reminded me that a badge doesn't make us different. It gives us a responsibility to protect everyone equally." An elderly gentleman raised his hand. "My grandson wants to be a police officer now," he said with pride. "He saw how you handled that man with dignity, even after he hit you. That's the kind of police officer he wants to be." Wilson felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the healing bruise on his cheek. This was why he joined the force all those years ago, to make a difference, to show that law enforcement could be a force for positive change. Later that afternoon, Wilson received an unexpected visitor. It was Brennan's sister, Catherine, looking tired but determined. "Chief Wilson," she began hesitantly, "I've been working with your community outreach team. We're starting a support group for families affected by online radicalization. My brother, he wasn't always like this. We want to help other families spot the warning signs." Wilson listened as she outlined their plans. It was another unexpected positive outcome. Families working together to prevent others from going down the same path. The day ended with a video conference call involving police chiefs from neighboring cities. They were all eager to implement similar community programs, having seen the success in Maplewood. Wilson shared his experiences and the lessons learned, emphasizing the importance of building trust before crises occurred. As he finally headed home, Wilson passed the supermarket where it had all started. The parking lot was full of shoppers going about their business, but something was different. Store security now wore clearly marked uniforms and worked alongside community volunteers. People nodded and greeted each other, regardless of their backgrounds. Sarah was waiting at home with dinner ready. "Rough day?" she asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "Actually," Wilson replied, hanging up his jacket, "it was a good day. Sometimes it takes a moment of darkness to help people find their light." The bruise on his cheek was fading, but its impact on the community was just beginning to bloom into something beautiful. Proof that even the worst moments could lead to positive change when handled with dignity and purpose. 3 months after the incident, Chief Wilson stood at the entrance of Maplewood Police Academy, watching a new class of recruits file in for their first day of training. The department had received a record number of applications, many citing the supermarket incident as their inspiration to join law enforcement. Inside the classroom, Wilson noticed the diversity of the recruits, people of all backgrounds who shared a common desire to serve their community. The training curriculum had been completely revamped, with new modules focusing on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and community engagement. Today, Wilson began, addressing the eager faces before him. "You're not just learning how to be police officers. You're learning how to be community builders." He touched his cheek where the bruise had once been, now completely healed but forever etched in the city's memory. The morning's lecture was interrupted by Linda, his assistant, who hurried in with important news. The FBI had just arrested several leaders of the online network that had influenced Brennan. The investigation that started in Maplewood had uncovered a sophisticated web of hate groups masquerading as neighborhood watch organizations. "Their entire network is falling apart," Linda explained, handing him the report. "Communities across the country are implementing our reporting system. They're calling it the Maplewood Model." During lunch break, Wilson visited the station's new Community Response Center. What had once been an unused storage room was now a bustling hub of activity. Mrs. Rodriguez was there, volunteering as a translator for Spanish-speaking residents. The young barista who had been harassed now led weekly youth outreach programs. "Chief," called out Officer Martinez, waving him over to his desk. "You need to see this." He pulled up a video on his computer. It was a national news segment about communities transforming their police departments using Maplewood's approach. Wilson watched as familiar scenes played across the screen. The new training programs, the community meetings, the partnerships with local organizations. But what caught his attention were the interviews with residents who spoke about feeling safer, more connected, and more trusting of law enforcement. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. Their daughter Lisa's college thesis about police-community relations, inspired by her father's experience, had won a national award. She was being invited to speak at police academies across the country. Later that afternoon, Wilson received an unexpected letter. It was from Michael Brennan, writing from prison where he was serving his sentence. The letter was a genuine apology, explaining how the incident had forced him to confront his own prejudices and the harm he had caused. "Your response to my actions," Brennan wrote, "showed me what real authority looks like. It's not about power or fear, it's about dignity and service." Wilson shared the letter with his command staff during their weekly meeting. The conversation turned to how they could help other departments learn from their experience. Plans were made for a national conference on community-oriented policing, with Maplewood as the host city. As evening approached, Wilson walked through downtown Maplewood. The changes were subtle but significant. Store owners chatted with patrol officers who knew them by name. Citizens freely approached police to report concerns or simply say hello. The invisible barriers that had once divided the community were slowly dissolving. At the supermarket where it all began, a new mural covered the outer wall. Created by local artists, it depicted diverse hands joined together, forming a chain of unity. Below it, a simple plaque read, "Where a moment of hate transformed into a movement of hope." Wilson stopped to admire the artwork, remembering that Saturday morning that had changed everything. A group of children played nearby, wearing plastic police badges, but unlike before, they were playing together, regardless of their backgrounds. Back at home, Sarah was preparing for a community dinner they were hosting. Leaders from various neighborhoods would be coming together to discuss the next phase of their community-building initiatives. "You know," Sarah said, setting the table, "sometimes I think that slap woke up the whole city." Wilson smiled, helping her with the preparations. "Sometimes it takes a shock to open people's eyes," he replied, "but it's what we do after the shock that matters." As the sun set over Maplewood, casting long shadows across the transformed city, Wilson reflected on how a single moment of confrontation had sparked a movement of connection. The bruise had healed, but the lessons remained, teaching everyone that true change begins when people choose dignity over division, understanding over fear, and community over conflict. 1 year after the supermarket incident, Maplewood had transformed into a model city for community policing. Chief Wilson stood at the podium in the National Police Chiefs Convention. The convention center was filled to capacity. In the front row sat Sarah and Lisa, along with Mrs. Rodriguez, Officer Martinez, and other key figures from the community who had helped bring about change. Even Jenny from the supermarket was there, now serving as a civilian liaison for the police department's community outreach program. "A year ago," Wilson began, his voice steady and clear, "a man slapped me in a supermarket parking lot because of the color of my skin. He didn't know I was a police chief. He just saw what his prejudice wanted him to see." He paused, looking out at the attentive faces. That slap was heard around the nation, but it's what happened afterward that matters most. The screen behind him showed statistics from the past year. Hate crimes down by 70%, community trust in law enforcement up by 85%, and police recruitment from minority communities increased by 200%. But more importantly, it showed images of a community coming together, neighborhood barbecues where officers and residents shared meals, youth programs where former troublemakers now mentored younger kids, and community watch groups that represented every part of society. Michael Brennan will be released from prison next month, Wilson revealed, causing a stir in the audience. But he's not returning to the same city he left. While he worked to reform himself, we worked to reform our community. Wilson then introduced a surprise guest, Catherine Brennan, Michael's sister, who had become a national speaker on preventing radicalization and building community bridges. She had turned her family's shame into a mission for positive change. "My brother's actions sparked a revolution," Catherine said, joining Wilson at the podium. "Not of violence or division, but of understanding and unity. The Maplewood model isn't just about policing, it's about humanity." The convention ended with the announcement of a nationwide initiative to implement Maplewood's programs in cities